Thomas Whitmore's weathered hands froze on the kitchen door frame, his coffee mug slipping from his grip to shatter against the pine floor. Through the window, he watched his maid Rebecca Hayes sprint across the wheat field like the devil himself was chasing her, her phone pressed to her ear, sobbing words that cut through the morning air. "He knows. They're coming for me." This wasn't the terrified flight of someone running from danger. This was the desperate escape of someone running from him. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm dropped her laundry basket, white sheets billowing like surrender flags as she stared at the fleeing girl. The morning silence cracked like thin ice, filled only with Rebecca's fading cries and the distant rumble of an approaching black sedan. For 20 years, Thomas had spoken to empty chairs, set 4 plates for one man's supper, and talked to shadows that never answered back. Now the one person who'd brought life back to his kitchen was running away like he was her worst nightmare. "Stop!" The word tore from his throat, raw and desperate. Who was she really running from? And why did her terror feel like his salvation slipping away? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The silence that followed Rebecca's disappearance settled over the Whitmore farm like dust after a summer storm. Thomas stood among the scattered coffee cup fragments, his mind struggling to process what he'd witnessed. For a man who couldn't recognize his own reflection in the mirror, he'd learned to read people through their voices, their movements, their presence. Rebecca Hayes had been different from the moment she'd knocked on his door 3 months ago. At 64, Thomas had resigned himself to a life measured in solitary meals and one-sided conversations with his late wife, Margaret's photograph. The 640-acre wheat farm that had belonged to the Whitmore family for 4 generations now felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Every corner held ghosts. Margaret's lavender soap still sat untouched by the bathroom sink, and little Grace's drawings remained taped to the refrigerator, their edges yellowed with 20 years of grief. The barn fire had taken everything that mattered. Margaret and 4-year-old Grace had been trapped in the old farmhouse when an electrical fault turned their home into an inferno. Thomas had tried to reach them, earned himself a head injury that left him unable to recognize faces, and lived with the survivor's guilt that gnawed at him like winter wind through broken shutters. Some nights, he still heard Grace's laughter echoing through the empty hallways, still expected Margaret to call him in for supper. Then Rebecca had arrived, appearing at his door like an answer to prayers he'd stopped saying. Young, maybe 24, with sad eyes and hands that knew their way around farm work without being taught. She'd asked for a job with the quiet desperation of someone who had nowhere else to go, and Thomas had hired her on the spot, not because he needed help, but because her voice carried a familiar melody that made the farmhouse feel less like a tomb. She'd been perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. The way she knew exactly how Thomas liked his coffee, black with just a touch of honey, how she instinctively avoided the squeaky floorboard by the kitchen window, the one that had announced footsteps for decades. How she'd started humming while she worked, the same lullaby Margaret used to sing to Grace, but now the spell was broken. Thomas walked to the window where he'd last seen her, noting the way she'd veered toward the old dirt road that led to town rather than the main highway. She knew the land. She knew the shortcuts. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. On the kitchen table, Rebecca's unfinished breakfast sat growing cold. 2 eggs over easy, toast cut diagonally just like Margaret used to make for Grace. Beside her plate lay a small piece of paper that Thomas hadn't noticed before. With trembling fingers, he unfolded it to reveal a child's crayon drawing of their farmhouse, complete with the red barn and the old oak tree by the front gate. But the farmhouse in the drawing showed details that had been destroyed in the fire 20 years ago. Thomas studied the crayon drawing with hands that refused to stay steady. The childish artwork showed their farmhouse exactly as it had been before the fire. The wraparound porch with Margaret's flower boxes, the weather vane shaped like a rooster that had melted in the flames, even the little wooden swing that had hung from the oak tree's lowest branch. Details that existed now only in his memory and in one faded photograph he kept hidden in his bedroom drawer. He searched Rebecca's room in the small cottage behind the main house, a structure he'd built for seasonal workers back when the farm employed a dozen hands. Her belongings were few but telling. 3 changes of clothes, all in muted colors, a worn Bible with passages about forgiveness heavily underlined, and a prescription bottle that made his blood run cold. The label read, Rebecca Hayes, but the medication was for severe anxiety and trauma-related disorders. The prescribing physician was listed as Dr. Marcus Caldwell from something called the Serenity Hills Medical Institute. Thomas had never heard of either the doctor or the facility, but the prescription date was only 2 weeks old, fresh enough to suggest ongoing treatment, fresh enough to explain Rebecca's occasional distant stares and the way she sometimes flinched when he moved too quickly. In the cottage's tiny kitchen drawer, he found more evidence that shattered his understanding of the past 3 months. Phone bills showing dozens of calls to the same Serenity Hills number, always lasting exactly 15 minutes, always placed on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock. Medical appointment cards with Rebecca's name but different addresses, some in neighboring counties, some as far away as Denver. And most disturbing of all, a manila envelope containing what appeared to be therapy session notes written in a careful, clinical hand. The notes spoke of memory reconstruction therapy and identity integration protocols. They mentioned a patient struggling with false attachment syndrome and regressive behavioral patterns. One entry, dated just last week, sent ice through Thomas's veins. Subject continues to exhibit emotional bonding with target individual. Recommend immediate extraction before complete memory recovery occurs. Target individual. Thomas felt the words settle in his stomach like lead shot. He thought of Rebecca's sudden arrival, her uncanny knowledge of the farm's routines, her inexplicable familiarity with rooms she'd never entered before. He thought of the way she'd known exactly where Margaret kept the good china, how she'd started organizing the pantry according to a system that had been Margaret's own invention. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Thomas rarely received calls. Most folks in their rural community knew about his condition and preferred to visit in person. He hesitated before answering, his caller ID displaying only private number. "Mr. Whitmore?" The voice was smooth, professional, with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "This is Dr. Marcus Caldwell from Serenity Hills Medical Institute. I believe you have something that belongs to us." Thomas gripped the phone tighter, his free hand crushing Rebecca's medical notes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Rebecca Hayes, Mr. Whitmore. I'm sure she's told you about her condition. She's been under our care for quite some time, and her disappearance this morning has us very concerned. Patients in her state can be dangerous to themselves and others when they're off their medication." "Dangerous?" Thomas's voice cracked. "The only dangerous thing I've seen is someone running away in terror." "What did you people do to her?" Dr. Caldwell's laugh was soft, patronizing. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand this must be confusing for someone with your particular challenges. Face blindness can make it difficult to assess people accurately. Rebecca has been suffering from severe delusions, particularly involving family substitution fantasies. She often believes strangers are her relatives, creates elaborate scenarios where she belongs in their lives. It's quite common in patients with her type of trauma history." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He thought of Rebecca's immediate comfort in his home, her knowledge of family routines, the way she'd seemed to breathe life back into rooms that had been dead for 20 years. Had it all been an elaborate delusion? Had he been so desperate for connection that he'd ignored obvious signs of mental illness? "We'll be sending a team to collect her this afternoon," Dr. Caldwell continued. "For everyone's safety, it's best if you don't try to contact her." These fantasies can become quite intense, and breaking them too abruptly can cause severe psychological damage. Thomas ended the call without responding, his mind reeling. He walked back to the kitchen window where he'd watched Rebecca flee, noting for the first time that she'd run toward the old cemetery road, the path that led past the graves where Margaret and Grace were buried, the same path Grace used to take when she'd sneak away to pick wildflowers for her mother's kitchen table. A terrible possibility began forming in his mind, one that defied logic and challenged everything he thought he knew about loss, about grief, about the finality of death. But as he stood there holding a child's drawing of his home as it had been 20 years ago, Thomas realized that maybe logic wasn't the most important thing after all. Maybe sometimes love was stronger than reason. Maybe sometimes the impossible was just another word for miracle. Thomas drove his old Ford pickup down the winding road toward town, Rebecca's medical files spread across the passenger seat like pieces of a puzzle he was afraid to solve. The familiar landmarks, Miller's feed store, the white steeple of First Baptist, the weathered sign welcoming visitors to Cedar Valley, population 847, blurred past his windows as his mind raced with possibilities that seemed to mock everything he'd accepted about his life for the past 20 years. The Serenity Hills Medical Institute sat on the outskirts of town in what used to be the old Morrison Mansion, a Victorian monstrosity that had been abandoned for decades before someone converted it into a medical facility. Thomas had driven past it countless times without giving it much thought, but now the imposing structure seemed to loom against the afternoon sky like something out of a Gothic novel. Manicured lawns and pristine white fencing gave it an air of respectability that didn't quite mask an underlying sense of isolation. Dr. Marcus Caldwell met him in a reception area that felt more like a luxury hotel lobby than a medical facility. The man was younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps 50, with silver-touched temples and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of being the smartest person in the room. His handshake was firm, professional, and somehow managed to convey both sympathy and authority. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming in. I know this must be very difficult for you." Dr. Caldwell gestured toward a leather chair that probably cost more than Thomas made in a month. "Rebecca spoke of you often during our sessions. She's quite fond of you, which makes this situation all the more challenging." Thomas remained standing, his farmer's instincts telling him to stay mobile, stay ready. "Where is she?" "Safe." "Sedated for her own protection, but safe." Dr. Caldwell moved behind his desk, a barrier of polished mahogany that seemed to emphasize the distance between them. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you some questions that might seem intrusive, but they're necessary for Rebecca's treatment. Has she ever mentioned having memories of your family? Your late wife and daughter, perhaps?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He thought of Rebecca humming Margaret's lullabies, of the way she'd instinctively known where everything belonged in the kitchen, of her drawing that showed details only Grace could have known. What if she has? Dr. Caldwell leaned forward, his expression a careful blend of professional concern and something that might have been pity. "Then I'm afraid her condition is more advanced than we initially thought. Rebecca suffers from what we call identity displacement disorder. She unconsciously absorbs details about the families she encounters and weaves them into elaborate fantasies where she belongs with them. It's a coping mechanism developed in response to severe childhood trauma." "What kind of trauma?" "She was found as a child, Mr. Whitmore, 4 years old, wandering a highway in Montana with no memory of how she got there, no identification, no family to claim her. She spent her childhood in the foster system, moving from home to home, never quite finding where she belonged. The mind, especially a young mind, sometimes creates its own solutions to unbearable circumstances. Thomas felt the room spinning slightly, his grip tightening on the back of the chair he'd refused to sit in. Montana. 4 years old. 20 years ago. The timing sent ice water through his veins, but he forced himself to maintain composure. That doesn't explain how she knew things about my family that nobody else could know. Doctor. Caldwell's smile was patient, the kind reserved for those who refuse to accept obvious truths. You'd be surprised what people reveal about themselves without realizing it. Mr. Whitmore. A photograph glimpsed in passing, a story shared by a neighbor, details mentioned in casual conversation. Rebecca has an exceptional ability to collect and synthesize information, then present it back in ways that seem miraculous. It's part of her pathology. I want to see her. I'm afraid that's not possible. Not yet. Dr. Caldwell stood, moving toward a filing cabinet with deliberate casualness. There's something else we need to discuss, something that might help you understand the severity of Rebecca's condition. We've run some preliminary medical tests, standard procedure for all our patients. Would you be willing to provide a DNA sample for comparison? Thomas stared at the man, his mind racing. Why would you need that? Because Rebecca believes she's your daughter, Mr. Whitmore. She's convinced herself that she's Grace Whitmore, that she somehow survived the fire that killed your family. It's an elaborate delusion, but a persistent one. A simple DNA test would provide definitive proof that there's no biological connection, which is often the first step in helping patients separate fantasy from reality. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Thomas thought of Grace's laugh echoing through empty hallways, of Margaret's voice calling him in for supper, of 20 years of grief built on the assumption that his family was gone forever. He thought of Rebecca's terror that morning, the way she'd run from him like he was her greatest fear rather than her salvation. And if the test shows what you expect it to show, Thomas asked quietly, then we proceed with Rebecca's treatment, help her work through her delusions, and hopefully place her in a more appropriate care facility where she can't form these intense attachments. It's really the kindest thing for everyone involved. Thomas nodded slowly, accepting the cotton swab Dr. Caldwell offered. As he scraped it against the inside of his cheek, he found himself wondering if he was about to prove his own foolishness or challenge everything this confident doctor believed about the nature of loss and recovery. The sample went into a sterile tube that Dr. Caldwell labeled with practiced efficiency. "How long for results?" Thomas asked. 48 hours. I'll call you personally with the findings." Dr. Caldwell walked him toward the door, his hand resting briefly on Thomas's shoulder in a gesture that felt both comforting and dismissive. "Try not to worry, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for people we care about is help them face reality, even when that reality is painful." As Thomas drove away from Serenity Hills, he couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Caldwell was right about one thing. Reality was indeed about to become painful. He just wasn't sure for whom. The 48-hour wait stretched like a lifetime of doubt. Thomas found himself pacing the farmhouse at all hours, moving from room to room as if the familiar spaces might yield answers he couldn't find elsewhere. He'd pulled out every photograph, every memento, every trace of Grace and Margaret that he'd carefully preserved over the years. The evidence spread across his kitchen table told the story of a life interrupted. Grace's baby teeth in a small jewelry box, Margaret's recipe cards written in her careful cursive, a hospital bracelet from Grace's birth that he'd never had the heart to throw away. On the second morning, he drove to the cemetery where Margaret and Grace were buried. Their headstones stood side by side under the old oak tree, the granite weathered but still legible. Margaret Ann Whitmore, beloved wife and mother, and Grace Elizabeth Whitmore, our little angel, age 4. Thomas knelt between the graves, his arthritic knees protesting against the cold ground. "I don't know what to think anymore, Maggie," he whispered to the stone. "If I'm losing my mind, if I'm seeing things that aren't there because I want them so badly to be real, maybe that's okay. Maybe 20 years of being alone is enough." The phone call came at exactly 3:17 that afternoon. Thomas was in the barn trying to distract himself with repairs that didn't need doing when his cell phone buzzed against his workbench. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Dr. Caldwell. I have your test results." Thomas set down his hammer with hands that had developed a tremor overnight. "Go ahead." "The DNA analysis shows no genetic relationship between you and Rebecca Hayes. 0% probability of paternal connection." Dr. Caldwell's voice carried a note of professional satisfaction, the tone of a man proven right. "I know this might be disappointing, but it confirms what we suspected about Rebecca's condition. She's created an elaborate fantasy, and unfortunately, she's drawn you into it." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling something inside his chest crack like old wood under pressure. "I see. I'd like you to come in tomorrow morning. We need to discuss Rebecca's long-term care options, and frankly, we're concerned about your emotional investment in this situation. Sometimes when people are isolated for long periods, they become vulnerable to these kinds of manipulations, even when they're unintentional." After ending the call, Thomas sat in the gathering dusk of his barn, surrounded by tools his father had taught him to use, in a building his grandfather had raised with his own hands. 4 generations of Whitmore men had worked this land, and now it would die with him. The bank notices had been arriving with increasing frequency, final notices, foreclosure warnings, legal threats that he'd been ignoring in favor of chasing ghosts and shadows. But even as he accepted the scientific proof of his delusion, something nagged at him. Rebecca's knowledge hadn't been limited to details that could be gleaned from observation or casual conversation. She'd known that Margaret hid birthday presents in the old cedar chest, a secret only the family had shared. She'd hummed not just any lullaby, but the specific melody Margaret had made up for Grace, a tune that existed nowhere else in the world. She'd instinctively avoided the loose floorboard by the back door, the one that had been repaired after the fire and looked identical to all the others. That evening, Thomas drove to the Copper Kettle Diner in town, the kind of place where coffee was always hot and gossip flowed as freely as the cream. Ethel Morrison had been serving meals there for 30 years, and if anyone knew the local stories, it would be her. "Tommy Whitmore, as I live and breathe," Ethel called out as he entered, her voice carrying across the half-empty restaurant. "I don't see you in town much these days. Heard you hired yourself some help out at the farm." Thomas slid into a corner booth, accepting the coffee Ethel poured without being asked. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Ethel. This girl, Rebecca, you know anything about her background?" Ethel's expression grew cautious, the way it did when conversation ventured into territory that might be better left unexplored. "Can't say I know much. Pretty thing, quiet. Heard she was staying out at your place, helping with the housework." "Ethel, I need you to think back about 20 years, the night of the fire. You remember much about that time?" The older woman's face darkened, her hands stilling on the coffee pot. "That's not something folks like to talk about, Tommy. Terrible business losing Maggie and little Grace like that." "But you were on the volunteer fire department then. You were there that night." Ethel glanced around the diner, confirming they were alone except for old Pete Martinez reading his newspaper in the far corner. She slid into the booth across from Thomas, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are things about that night that never sat right with me, Tommy. Things that the official reports didn't include." Thomas leaned forward, his heart beginning to race. What kind of things? Well, for one, we never found Grace's body. Found what was left of poor Maggie in the hallway. God rest her soul. But Grace's room was collapsed, burned so hot there wasn't much left of anything. The coroner said the heat would have... Well, he said there wouldn't necessarily be remains to find. But you had doubts. I had questions. See, when we got to your place, the fire had been burning for a while, but there were tire tracks in the mud by the back gate, fresh ones that didn't match any of the emergency vehicles. And Pete over there? She nodded toward the elderly man with the newspaper. Pete was coming home from his night shift at the grain elevator. He swears he saw a car leaving your property right around the time the fire started, heading toward the state highway. Thomas felt the diner spinning slightly around him. Why didn't anyone investigate that? Who was going to investigate? Sheriff Kowalski retired right after that whole mess, moved to Florida and never looked back. His deputy, Bill Morgan, Bill's sheriff now, he was young then, didn't want to go stirring up trouble without hard evidence. And honestly, Tommy, you were in the hospital for weeks, in no shape to push for answers. By the time you were back on your feet, the case was closed. Ethel reached across the table and patted his hand with work-worn fingers. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, getting your hopes up over old suspicions. But that girl working for you now, there's something about her that reminds me of someone. Can't put my finger on it, but it's been bothering me since she came to town. Thomas drove home through a landscape that looked different in the moonlight, as if the familiar fields and fences had rearranged themselves while he wasn't paying attention. Ethel's words echoed in his mind, mixing with Dr. Caldwell's clinical certainty and his own desperate hope to create a confusion that made his head throb. Back at the farmhouse, he pulled out a box he hadn't opened in years, Margaret's personal effects that had survived the fire. Most of her things had been in the main part of the house, but she'd kept some items in the storm cellar where Thomas stored canned goods and emergency supplies. He found what he was looking for near the bottom of the box. Margaret's journal from Grace's early years, the one where she'd recorded every milestone, every funny saying, every precious moment of their daughter's short life. Reading by lamplight at his kitchen table, Thomas discovered details he'd forgotten, memories that grief had buried. Grace had been left-handed, just like Rebecca. She'd had a birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. She'd been terrified of thunderstorms but loved the sound of rain on the roof. She'd had an imaginary friend named Mr. Buttons, who she insisted lived in the barn loft. But one entry, dated just 3 months before the fire, made Thomas's blood run cold. Grace drew the strangest picture today. When I asked her what it was, she said it was our house from before the fire. When I told her there hadn't been any fire, she looked at me with those serious little eyes and said, "Not yet, Mama." But there will be. Sometimes I think that child sees things the rest of us can't. Thomas closed the journal with shaking hands. Children said odd things, invented elaborate stories, confused dreams with reality. But combined with everything else, the tire tracks, the missing body, the inexplicable knowledge Rebecca possessed, Margaret's words took on a significance that defied rational explanation. He was still sitting at the table when headlights swept across his front windows. The digital clock on the microwave read 11:43 p.m., far too late for social calls in a community where most folks were in bed by 9. Thomas peered through the curtains to see a black sedan parked in his driveway, the same type of vehicle he'd glimpsed the morning Rebecca fled. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the passenger side, accompanied by 2 men in white uniforms who moved with the efficient purposefulness of people accustomed to handling difficult situations. They approached his front door with the confidence of authority, and Thomas realized with growing dread that this wasn't a social visit. The knock, when it came, was firm and unyielding. "Mr. Whitmore? Dr. Caldwell from Serenity Hills? I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but we have reason to believe Rebecca may have attempted to contact you. For her safety and yours, we need to search the premises." Thomas opened the door but didn't step aside. "You have a warrant for that search?" Dr. Caldwell's smile was thin, patient. "Mr. Whitmore, Rebecca is a danger to herself and potentially to others when she's off her medication. She's had episodes of violence when her delusions are challenged. We're not here to cause trouble, we're here to prevent it." Behind Dr. Caldwell, the two uniformed men shifted slightly, their hands moving to equipment on their belts that looked more like restraints than medical devices. Thomas realized that regardless of what he said or did, these men were coming into his house. The only question was whether they'd meet resistance or cooperation. "She's not here," Thomas said quietly, stepping aside. "Then you won't mind if we verify that." Dr. Caldwell entered without waiting for further invitation, his companions spreading out with practiced efficiency to search the house. As Thomas watched strangers move through his home, opening closets and checking rooms that hadn't seen visitors in decades, he felt a rage building that had nothing to do with property rights and everything to do with the violation of space that held his most precious memories. These men moved through Margaret's kitchen, Grace's former bedroom, the hallways where his family's laughter still echoed in the quiet moments before dawn. "Mr. Whitmore, Doctor," Caldwell said, returning from his inspection of the upstairs rooms. "I want you to understand that Rebecca's condition makes her extremely manipulative. She'll say anything, claim any connection, to avoid treatment. When she contacts you, and she will contact you, I need you to call us immediately. Don't try to handle the situation yourself." After they left, Thomas stood in his violated home and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The DNA test might prove that Rebecca wasn't his daughter, but science didn't explain everything. Sometimes the heart knew truths that laboratories couldn't measure, and sometimes a man had to choose between accepting the evidence of his senses or trusting the deeper wisdom of love that transcended biology. If Rebecca was in danger, if she was running from people who wanted to drag her back to a place that terrified her, then Thomas Whitmore was going to find her before they did. And if that made him a foolish old man chasing delusions, then so be it. He'd been called worse things by better people. The hunt was about to begin. The storm arrived without warning, the way prairie weather often did, one moment clear skies, the next a wall of black clouds that turned afternoon into twilight. Thomas had been tracking Rebecca's possible whereabouts for 3 days, following leads that took him to abandoned farmhouses, old hunting cabins, and the kind of forgotten places where someone might hide from the world. The approaching tempest seemed fitting somehow, as if nature itself was building toward the same climax that had been gathering in his chest since that morning he'd watched her flee. He found her at the old Hendricks place, a derelict farmhouse that had been empty since the family moved to Phoenix 15 years ago. The building sat in a grove of cottonwoods about 8 miles from his property, accessible only by a dirt track that most people had forgotten existed. Thomas spotted movement through a broken window and knew with the certainty that comes from a father's intuition that his search was over. Rebecca was huddled in what had once been the kitchen, wrapped in a blanket that looked like it had come from his own linen closet. She looked up when he entered, and the expression that crossed her face was pure terror, not the fear of discovery, but the deeper dread of someone who believed rescue would lead to something worse than hiding. "Please don't call them," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that was beginning to howl through the broken windows. "Please don't send me back there." Thomas knelt slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Nobody's sending you anywhere you don't want to go. Dr. Caldwell said you took the test. He said it proved I'm not, that I can't be." She couldn't finish the sentence, but the pain in her voice completed it for her. "Tests can be wrong," Thomas said quietly. "Labs make mistakes. Samples get mixed up." Hell, maybe I'm not who I think I am either. Thunder rolled across the prairie, and Rebecca flinched as if the sound carried personal menace. In the flickering light from Thomas's flashlight, he could see bruises on her wrists that looked suspiciously like restraint marks, and a bandage on her arm that suggested recent medical procedures. "They've been taking blood," she said, following his gaze. "Lots of blood. Dr. Caldwell says it's for tests, but they never tell me what the tests are for. And the sessions. The things they make me remember. The things they try to make me forget." Her voice trailed off as another flash of lightning illuminated the ruined kitchen. In that brief moment of stark white light, Thomas saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Rebecca had unconsciously positioned herself in the exact spot where the kitchen table would have been, her body angled toward where the window had once offered a view of the barnyard. It was precisely where Grace used to sit for her afternoon snack, watching for Thomas to come in from the fields. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "what's the last thing you remember from before you started living at the Institute?" She was quiet for so long that Thomas wondered if she'd heard the question. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the distant quality of someone accessing memories that had been buried deep. "Smoke," she whispered. "The smell of smoke, and someone carrying me, running through trees, branches scratching my face, a car that smelled like leather and cigarettes. Then, nothing clear until I was in a hospital, and a woman in a white coat was asking me my name over and over, but I couldn't remember." "How old were you?" "They said 4, maybe 5. The records were confused." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "Do you remember anything from before the smoke?" Rebecca closed her eyes, her face contorting with the effort of reaching into darkness that seemed to resist exploration. A man singing, a deep voice, singing something about working on the railroad, and hands, big hands, lifting me up to see over a fence, looking at horses in a field. The song hit Thomas like a physical blow. "I've been working on the railroad." It had been his go-to lullaby for Grace, the tune he'd hummed while carrying her around the farm. Margaret had always teased him about his off-key singing, but Grace had loved it, demanding the train song every night before bed. "What else?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "A woman with yellow hair, braiding mine. She always smelled like flowers and flour. She would hum while she braided, and sometimes she'd tell me stories about a place where all the animals could talk. And there was a room with pictures on the walls, pictures of a man and woman and a little girl, like a family. I used to pretend they were my family before I understood that pretending wasn't real." Thomas pulled out his wallet with trembling hands, extracting the one photograph he always carried. Margaret, Grace, and himself at Grace's 4th birthday party, taken just 6 weeks before the fire. Rebecca's eyes went wide when she saw it, her hand instinctively reaching out before jerking back as if the image might burn her. "That little girl," she whispered. She looks exactly like I did when I was small, before my hair got darker." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching cut through the storm, multiple engines moving fast despite the deteriorating road conditions. Through the broken windows, headlight beams began to sweep across the abandoned farmyard like searchlights hunting prey. "They found us," Rebecca breathed, shrinking back against the wall. "They always find me. Dr. Caldwell says they have ways of tracking people, medical ways that don't require permission." Thomas moved to the window, counting at least 3 vehicles forming a semicircle around the house. In the lightning flashes, he could see men in white uniforms deploying from the cars, carrying equipment that looked more suited for military operations than medical intervention. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the lead vehicle, speaking into a radio with the calm authority of someone directing a familiar operation. Rebecca Hayes. Dr. Caldwell's amplified voice cut through the storm. We know you're in there. You're sick and you need help. Mr. Whitmore, you're interfering with a medical emergency. Step away from the patient and exit the building. Rebecca began to hyperventilate, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. They'll take me back to the White Room. They'll make me forget again. Please, please don't let them take me back to the White Room. Thomas felt something crystallize inside him, a clarity that cut through 20 years of grief and doubt and self-recrimination. Standing in that ruined kitchen, watching this terrified young woman beg him not to abandon her, he realized that science and logic and DNA tests mattered less than the simple truth that some bonds transcended blood, some families were chosen rather than inherited, and some loves were strong enough to challenge the authority of men who believed they could reduce human connection to laboratory data. Listen to me, he said, gripping Rebecca's shoulders. I don't care what any test says. I don't care what Dr. Caldwell believes. You are my daughter. Maybe not by blood, maybe not by birth, but by every measure that matters, and I'm not letting them take you. The front door exploded inward as Dr. Caldwell's team breached the house with the efficiency of a SWAT unit. Men in white uniforms flooded the kitchen carrying restraints and syringes and the cold confidence of authority unopposed. Thomas stepped in front of Rebecca, his 64-year-old farmer's frame suddenly feeling inadequate against trained professionals who dealt with resistance as a routine part of their job. Step away from her, Mr. Whitmore, Dr. Caldwell ordered, entering behind his team. You're having a psychological episode. This girl is not your daughter. Your daughter died 20 years ago. Then why are you so afraid of her? Thomas shot back. Why the army of men? Why the restraints? If she's just a delusional girl who thinks she belongs to me, why not let her have her fantasy? Dr. Caldwell's composure slipped for just a moment, something cold and calculating flickering behind his professional mask. Because delusions can be dangerous, Mr. Whitmore. Especially when they threaten to expose truths that are better left buried. The words hung in the electrified air of the storm-torn kitchen, a confession disguised as a medical explanation. Thomas felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place, the understanding that Dr. Caldwell's interest in Rebecca went far beyond treating a disturbed patient. This was about covering up something that had happened 20 years ago, something that had begun with tire tracks in the mud and a little girl who had disappeared from a burning house. Sedate them both, Dr. Caldwell ordered. We'll sort this out back at the facility. As the men closed in with their needles and restraints, Rebecca suddenly straightened, her terrified demeanor shifting into something Thomas had never seen before. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear, determined tone of someone who had finally stopped running. My name is Grace Elizabeth Whitmore, she said. I was born on June 15, 1999, and my father taught me to sing the train song when I was scared. My mother made me apple pie with extra cinnamon because store-bought never tasted right. And you, Dr. Caldwell, are the man who stole me from my burning house and told the world I was dead. The kitchen erupted into chaos as Rebecca's declaration hit the room like lightning striking twice in the same place. Dr. Caldwell's careful control shattered, his team hesitating as they looked between their employer and this young woman who had just accused him of kidnapping and conspiracy. In that moment of confusion, Thomas saw their only chance. He grabbed Rebecca's hand and ran toward the back of the house, where a door led to the storm cellar he'd noticed during his earlier reconnaissance. Behind them, Dr. Caldwell shouted orders that were lost in the thunder, and the sound of pursuit echoed through the abandoned rooms like the footsteps of judgment, finally catching up to 20 years of lies. The storm cellar door slammed shut above them just as the first of Dr. Caldwell's men reached the back of the house. Thomas threw the heavy wooden bar across the door. a primitive but effective lock that would buy them precious minutes. The cellar was pitch black except for the weak beam of his flashlight, illuminating stone walls that wept moisture and wooden shelves lined with canning jars that had been abandoned to time and neglect. Rebecca pressed against the far wall, her earlier moment of defiant clarity giving way to the trembling aftermath of adrenaline. Above them, heavy footsteps thundered across the old floorboards as Dr. Caldwell's team searched the house room by room, their frustrated voices carrying through the storm. "There's no other way out," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible above the muffled sounds of pursuit. "They'll wait us out, and then they'll take me back to that place." "Back to the white room where they make you forget everything that matters." Thomas swept his flashlight across the cellar walls, looking for options that didn't exist. The space was maybe 8 feet by 10, carved from the earth with the same practical simplicity that had built farmhouses to last through prairie storms and economic hardships. But unlike the storm cellars he knew, this one had something unusual, a section of the far wall where the stonework looked newer, less weathered than the rest. "Grace," he said, testing the name that felt both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "Tell me about the White Room." She flinched at the direct use of her real name, but something in Thomas's voice seemed to anchor her. "It's where they do the sessions. Dr. Caldwell calls it memory reconstruction therapy. They put you in a chair with straps, and they show you pictures while they ask questions. Sometimes they give you injections that make everything fuzzy, and when you wake up, things you remember feel different, less real." "What kind of pictures?" "Families. Happy families with children. He would show me picture after picture and ask if I recognized anyone. When I said no, he would nod like that was the right answer. But sometimes I would see a face, a man's face, kind eyes, weathered hands, and I would feel something, like recognition, but deeper, like coming home." Thomas felt his throat constrict. "And when you had those feelings?" "More injections, more sessions, until the feeling went away and the faces became just pictures again." Rebecca's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But they never could take away the dreams. In my dreams, I was always running through wheat fields, and someone was calling my name, a man's voice, strong and safe, calling me home for supper." Above them, the footsteps had stopped, replaced by the sound of tools against wood. They were trying to break through the cellar door, their patience exhausted by the storm and the complications this pursuit had become. Thomas examined the newer section of wall more closely, running his hands along the mortar that seemed different from the rest. When he pressed against one of the stones, it shifted slightly, and he realized this wasn't just repair work, it was a deliberate concealment. "Help me with this," he said, handing Rebecca the flashlight. Together they began working the loose stones free, mortar crumbling under their desperate fingers. Behind the false wall, Thomas's flashlight revealed not another room, but a metal box wrapped in oilcloth, the kind of waterproofing someone would use to protect important documents. The first thing that fell out when he opened the box was a birth certificate. Grace Elizabeth Whitmore, born June 15, 1999, to Thomas James Whitmore and Margaret Ann Whitmore. The paper was slightly yellowed but perfectly preserved, official state seals and signatures intact. The second item was a hospital bracelet, tiny and pink with Baby Girl Whitmore printed in faded ink. The third was a photograph that made Thomas's hands shake so violently he nearly dropped it. Margaret, holding a newborn Grace, both of them surrounded by the soft light of a hospital room window. On the back, in Margaret's careful handwriting, "Our miracle baby comes home, July 2nd, 1999. But it was the fourth item that stopped his breathing entirely. A letter addressed to "Whoever finds this," written in the same handwriting. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me and to Grace. Dr. Marcus Caldwell has been asking questions around town, wanting to know about children who might not be missed, families that keep to themselves. I think he took the Patterson boy last spring, though everyone believes Bobby just ran away. I'm hiding this because I'm afraid, and because if something happens to us, Thomas will need proof that Grace existed, that she was real, that she was ours. The man has been watching our house. I've seen his car on the road 3 times this week, always slowing down when he passes our mailbox. Thomas doesn't know. I haven't told him because he would confront Dr. Caldwell directly, and that might make things worse. But if something happens, if we disappear, look for the children who are being treated at his facility. Look for the families who stopped asking questions. And remember that some monsters wear medical degrees. The letter was dated 5 days before the fire. The cellar door splintered above them, wood cracking under the assault of crowbars and determination. Thomas stuffed the documents into his jacket, his mind reeling with the implications of Margaret's prophetic words. She had known. Somehow she had sensed the danger and tried to leave evidence, a trail of breadcrumbs for whoever might eventually come looking for the truth. "Dr. Caldwell," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice taking on the distant quality Thomas had learned to recognize as recovered memory surfacing. "I remember him from before. He came to the house once when I was very small. Mama sent me to my room, but I listened from the top of the stairs. He wanted to examine me, said there were programs for gifted children, special opportunities. Mama told him no, told him we weren't interested, but he kept talking. He said some children had potential that their families couldn't recognize, potential that could be developed in the right environment." "When was this?" "Weeks before the fire, maybe months. And he came back once more the night everything burned. I remember waking up to smoke and heat, and someone carrying me out through the window. Not Daddy, someone else. Someone who smelled like antiseptic and cigarettes." The cellar door gave way with a crash that shook dust from the ceiling. Flashlight beams stabbed down through the opening, followed by Dr. Caldwell's voice, no longer smooth and professional but sharp with anger and desperation. "Mr. Whitmore, you've seen the documents by now. I know Margaret hid them somewhere. She was always too clever for her own good. But those papers don't change anything. That girl is still my patient, still under my legal guardianship, and still coming with me." Thomas helped Rebecca up the wooden steps toward the opening, his arthritic joints protesting but his resolve absolute. As they emerged into the ruined house, Dr. Caldwell's team surrounded them with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. But something had changed in the dynamic. The men in white uniforms looked less certain, more troubled, as if Rebecca's earlier declaration had planted seeds of doubt about exactly what kind of operation they were supporting. "You murdered my wife," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the storm-damaged house. "You burned my home and stole my daughter. And for 20 years you've been telling the world she was dead while you used her as some kind of experiment." Dr. Caldwell's laugh was bitter, empty of the professional warmth that had characterized their earlier meetings. "I saved her, you fool. Margaret would have raised that child in ignorance and poverty, trapped her in the narrow life of a farmer's daughter. I gave Grace opportunities, education, a chance to reach her full potential. By erasing her memory, by making her forget who she was, by freeing her from the limitations of circumstance and sentiment. Do you have any idea what that child's mind is capable of? The patterns she can see, the connections she can make? She's extraordinary, but only when she's not weighed down by the mundane attachments that hold most people back." Rebecca stepped forward, her fear replaced by a rage that had been building for 20 years. "You stole my life. You stole my family. You made me forget my father's voice and my mother's touch, and you convinced me that love was a delusion that needed to be cured." Dr. Caldwell's composure cracked completely, revealing the obsession that had driven him for 2 decades. Love is a chemical reaction, nothing more. Attachment is an evolutionary accident that serves no purpose in a modern world. I've proven that with proper intervention, the human mind can be freed from these primitive emotional shackles. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Thomas saw several of Dr. Caldwell's men exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand exactly what they had been helping to accomplish. One of them, a younger man who looked like he might have children of his own, slowly lowered his restraints. But Dr. Caldwell had one final card to play. And when he reached into his medical bag, Thomas realized that the man who had spent 20 years erasing love from human hearts was not going to allow his life's work to be undone by the very emotions he had sought to eliminate. Dr. Caldwell's hand emerged from his medical bag, gripping a syringe filled with clear liquid, his calm, professional demeanor replaced by the desperate fury of a man watching his life's work crumble around him. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what would come next. 20 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of obsession and madness. 20 years of careful conditioning, of scientific progress, of proving that human attachment is nothing more than a chemical dependency that can be cured. I will not let you destroy that. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Rebecca, but one of Dr. Caldwell's remaining loyal assistants grabbed his arms, restraining him with practiced efficiency. The other members of the team had backed away, their faces showing the dawning horror of men who were beginning to understand they had been complicit in something far worse than medical treatment. The child is the key, Doctor. Caldwell continued, advancing toward Rebecca with the syringe raised. She's my proof that love can be eliminated, that human beings can be perfected beyond the primitive emotional responses that have held our species back for millennia. One injection, and she'll forget this entire episode. She'll remember only that she tried to run away from her treatment and was safely returned to proper care. Rebecca pressed against the wall, but there was no fear in her eyes now, only a clarity that seemed to burn away 20 years of manufactured confusion. I remember everything, she said, her voice steady and strong. I remember the night you came to our house, the night you told Mama you could give me a better life. I remember you carrying me away from the fire you set, telling me my parents were dead, that I was alone in the world and you were my savior. Delusions, Dr. Caldwell snarled, but his hand was shaking now, the syringe wavering as his certainty cracked. Recovered memory syndrome, false recollections triggered by stress and suggestion. I've documented the phenomenon extensively. I remember you killing my mother. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that reached everyone present. Dr. Caldwell froze, his face going pale in the flashlight beams that illuminated the ruined kitchen. That's impossible, he whispered. You were unconscious from the smoke inhalation. You couldn't have seen, but I did see. Rebecca's voice carried the weight of recovered truth, memories that had been buried but never truly erased. I woke up when you were carrying me out through my bedroom window. I saw you go back into the house, heard Mama screaming your name, asking why you were doing this, and I saw you hit her with something heavy, saw her fall down in the hallway before the flames got too high to see anything else. Dr. Caldwell's carefully constructed world of scientific rationalization shattered like glass. The man who had spent decades trying to eliminate human emotion was undone by the very love he had sought to destroy, a daughter's indelible memory of her mother's murder, preserved despite all his attempts to erase it. She was going to take you away, he said, his voice breaking. Margaret called the state police that afternoon, said she had evidence that I was involved in children's disappearances. She was going to destroy everything I'd worked for, everything I'd accomplished. She couldn't understand that what I was doing was for the greater good of humanity. Thomas felt rage building in his chest like a physical force. 20 years of grief and loss and unanswered questions crystallizing into a fury that threatened to consume him. You burned my house down to cover up a kidnapping. You murdered my wife to steal my daughter. And you made me believe they were both dead so I would never come looking. I gave Grace opportunities, Dr. Caldwell screamed. I educated her, trained her mind, freed her from the provincial limitations of rural life. She can speak 6 languages, solve mathematical problems that would challenge university professors, analyze complex psychological patterns with intuitive brilliance. Would she have learned any of that as a farmer's daughter? She would have learned to be happy, Thomas said quietly. She would have learned what it felt like to be loved. The simple truth of those words hit Dr. Caldwell like a physical blow. He looked around the room at his assistants, seeing doubt and revulsion in their faces, where once there had been professional loyalty. The young man who had lowered his restraints earlier was now backing toward the door, his hand moving toward his cell phone. "Don't you understand?" Dr. Caldwell pleaded with his team. "Attachment is weakness. Love is an evolutionary mistake that causes more suffering than any disease. I've proven that children raised without emotional bonds develop superior cognitive abilities, enhanced logical reasoning, freedom from the irrational decisions that plague normal human development." "And where are those other children now?" Rebecca asked. "The ones you saved from their families? The ones you treated in your white room until they forgot who they used to be?" Dr. Caldwell's silence was answer enough. Thomas thought of the medical files he'd seen, the references to 23 patients, the careful documentation of memory reconstruction therapy. How many families had grieved for children who weren't really dead? How many graves held empty coffins while their loved ones lived imprisoned in the name of scientific progress? Some of them didn't survive the process, Dr. Caldwell admitted finally. The human mind is remarkably resilient when it comes to maintaining emotional connections. Complete erasure requires aggressive intervention, but the ones who succeeded, who transcended their primitive attachments, they've gone on to achieve remarkable things. "Or they've gone insane," said the young assistant who had been backing toward the door. "Dr. Caldwell, I've seen the long-term files. Half of your success stories are in psychiatric facilities. The other half committed suicide before their 30th birthdays." Dr. Caldwell whirled toward the speaker, the syringe still clutched in his trembling hand. "You don't understand the data. Those failures were necessary sacrifices for the advancement of human knowledge. Every great scientific breakthrough requires acceptable losses." But even as he spoke, Thomas could see the madness eating away at the man's rationalization. Dr. Caldwell had spent so many years convincing himself that love was a disease that he'd forgotten what made life worth living. He'd become a monster in the name of eliminating monsters, a man so afraid of human pain that he'd inflicted infinitely greater suffering in his attempt to prevent it. The sound of sirens began to penetrate the storm, distant but growing closer. The assistant with the cell phone had apparently made his call, and now the weight of real law enforcement was bearing down on Dr. Caldwell's carefully constructed house of lies. "This is over," Thomas said, moving slowly toward the doctor. "Grace is coming home with me. Your other patients are going to be found and returned to their families, and you're going to answer for every life you've destroyed in the name of your twisted science." Dr. Caldwell looked around wildly, seeing his empire crumbling, his life's work exposed as the elaborate torture it had always been. When he spoke again, his voice carried the broken quality of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his crimes. "I had a son," he whispered. "Danny." He was 7 when he died in a car accident, calling for me to save him while I watched helplessly from the wreckage. The pain of losing him nearly drove me insane. I thought if I could eliminate that kind of suffering, if I could free people from the agony of love and loss, I would be saving them from the hell I lived through. So you decided to make sure no other parent would ever have to feel that pain? Rebecca said, understanding dawning in her voice. By making sure no child would ever be truly loved in the first place. It seemed logical, Dr. Caldwell said, tears streaming down his face. It seemed like mercy. The sirens were close now, red and blue lights beginning to flash through the broken windows of the abandoned farmhouse. Dr. Caldwell looked at the syringe in his hand, then at Rebecca, then at Thomas, and something shifted in his expression, not sanity returning, but a different kind of madness, the desperation of a man who realized he was about to lose everything he'd built his identity around. "If I can't save her," he said, raising the syringe toward his own neck, "then at least I can save myself from having to watch another 20 years of work be destroyed." "No," Rebecca said, stepping forward with her hand extended. "Dr. Caldwell, you don't have to do this. You can get help. Real help. Not the kind you've been giving your patients, but actual treatment for whatever broke inside you when you lost your son." For a moment, Dr. Caldwell hesitated, the syringe wavering as he looked into the eyes of the woman he'd been trying to cure of love for 20 years. In her face he saw not the detached perfection he'd been trying to create, but the very emotion he'd sought to eliminate, compassion, even for the man who had stolen her life. "I'm not sure I want to be saved," he whispered. "Then do it for Danny," Thomas said quietly. "Do it because somewhere your son is watching, and he wouldn't want his death to be the reason so many other children suffered." The police burst through the front door at that moment, their flashlights and weapons trained on the scene in the kitchen. Dr. Caldwell looked around at the faces surrounding him, his horrified assistants, the father and daughter he'd tried to keep apart, the officers who had come to arrest him, and slowly lowered the syringe. "I want to confess," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I want to tell you about all of them. Every child, every family, every life I destroyed because I was too broken to understand that love isn't a disease to be cured." As the handcuffs clicked around Dr. Caldwell's wrists, Thomas felt a weight lifting from his chest that had been there for 20 years. The man who had murdered his wife and stolen his daughter was finally facing justice. But more importantly, the daughter he'd thought was lost forever was standing beside him, alive and whole and ready to come home. But even as relief flooded through him, Thomas realized that the hardest part was still ahead. Grace had spent 20 years being told that love was weakness, that family was illusion, that the bonds between people were nothing more than chemical reactions to be suppressed and eliminated. Bringing her home would be only the first step in a much longer journey of healing, of rebuilding the connections that Dr. Caldwell had tried so hard to destroy. The storm was beginning to break outside, and through the clouds Thomas could see the first hints of dawn painting the eastern sky. A new day was coming, and for the first time in 2 decades, he would not face it alone. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the doorway of what had once been Grace's childhood bedroom, watching his daughter carefully arrange wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill. The room looked different now, not because he'd changed anything, but because it was alive again, filled with the quiet presence of someone who belonged there. The transition hadn't been easy. Grace still woke sometimes in the middle of the night, disoriented and afraid, calling out for people who existed only in the false memories Dr. Caldwell had implanted. She still flinched when touched unexpectedly, still struggled with the concept that love didn't require her to be perfect or useful or anything other than herself. But she was healing, slowly and steadily, like a plant that had been kept in darkness finally learning to turn toward the sun. The legal proceedings had been a nightmare of depositions and testimony, of lawyers and journalists and federal investigators who descended on their quiet farming community like a plague of locusts. Dr. Caldwell's confession had opened floodgates that revealed the true scope of his crimes. 47 children over 23 years, families across 6 states who had grieved for sons and daughters who were actually imprisoned in various facilities under assumed names and false diagnoses. 23 of those children had been found alive, though not all of them could be saved. Years of memory suppression and chemical intervention had left some too damaged to recover, their minds trapped in the clinical detachment that Dr. Caldwell had mistaken for improvement. Others, like Grace, had been stronger than their captor realized, their fundamental sense of self buried but not destroyed. The media had dubbed it the Angel of Mercy case, painting Dr. Caldwell as a deranged monster who had preyed on vulnerable families. But Thomas knew the truth was more complex and somehow more terrifying. Dr. Caldwell had genuinely believed he was helping, had convinced himself that the suffering he inflicted was justified by the greater good he imagined he was serving. Evil, Thomas had learned, often wore the face of someone who thought they were saving the world. "Daddy?" Grace's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She still said the word carefully, as if testing its weight, but it came more naturally now than it had in those first difficult weeks. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Mrs. Henderson from next door brought over another casserole. She says it's her grandmother's recipe for tuna noodle surprise, but I think the surprise is that nobody knows what's actually in it." Thomas laughed, a sound that had become easier and more frequent as the months passed. The community had rallied around them in ways that still amazed him, bringing food, offering help with the farm, respecting their privacy while making it clear that support was always available. Ethel Morrison had appointed herself Grace's unofficial grandmother, teaching her to bake pies and sharing stories about Margaret that helped fill in the gaps left by 20 years of separation. The farm was thriving again, not just because Thomas had help with the work, but because it had purpose beyond mere survival. Insurance settlements and a victims' compensation fund had eliminated the financial pressures that had been crushing him for years. But more importantly, he had someone to pass the land on to, someone who understood that the 4 generations of Whitmore sweat in the soil made it more than just property. "I've been thinking," Grace said, settling on the edge of her bed with the careful deliberation she brought to most decisions, "about going back to school. Real school, not the kind Dr. Caldwell provided." Thomas sat beside her, noting how she still tensed slightly at unexpected movement, but no longer pulled away entirely. "What kind of school?" "I want to study psychology. I want to understand how minds heal, not how they break. There are other people like me, other survivors who are struggling to remember who they used to be. Maybe I can help them." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. The daughter, who had been stolen to become a brilliant but emotionally detached prodigy, was choosing to use her gifts to restore the very connections her captor had tried to eliminate. Dr. Caldwell had been right about Grace's exceptional intelligence, but catastrophically wrong about what that intelligence would choose to accomplish when guided by love rather than controlled by fear. "The state university has agreed to let me test out of most of the undergraduate requirements," Grace continued. "Dr. Patterson, the real doctor." "Patterson, not like Caldwell, thinks I could be ready for graduate work within 2 years, and there's a program specifically for helping trauma survivors recover suppressed memories safely." Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the instinctive fear of a parent whose child had already been taken once. But he also recognized the strength in Grace's voice, the determination of someone who had faced the worst humanity could offer and chosen to respond with hope rather than hatred. "What about the farm?" he asked, not because he wanted to guilt her into staying, but because he needed to know she'd considered all the implications of her choice. Grace smiled, and in that expression Thomas saw echoes of both Margaret's warmth and his own stubborn optimism. "The farm will always be here, and so will you. I'm not running away this time, Daddy. I'm just growing up the way I should have been allowed to 20 years ago." That evening, they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set over fields of wheat that rippled like golden water in the evening breeze. Grace was reading a psychology textbook she'd ordered from the university bookstore, occasionally reading interesting passages aloud, while Thomas worked on repairing a bridle that probably didn't need fixing but gave his hands something to do. The comfortable silence between them was broken by the sound of a car approaching on the gravel road. Thomas looked up to see Sheriff Morgan's patrol car, but his initial tension eased when he saw that this was a social visit rather than an official one. Morgan had been instrumental in exposing the larger conspiracy that had protected Dr. Caldwell for so many years, and he'd become a frequent visitor as he worked to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. "Evening, Thomas." "Grace." Morgan climbed the porch steps with the weary gait of a man who'd seen too much but was determined to see justice done. "Thought you'd want to know. The last of Caldwell's facilities was shut down today. Found 6 more kids, all of them going home to families who thought they were dead." Grace closed her textbook, giving the sheriff her full attention. "How are they doing, the other survivors?" "Better than expected, thanks partly to the support groups you helped establish. Turns out having someone who's been through the same hell makes all the difference in learning to trust again." As Morgan's car disappeared back down the road, Thomas looked at his daughter, really looked at her, taking in the determination in her eyes, the careful way she held herself, the quiet strength that had carried her through unimaginable trauma. She wasn't the 4-year-old he'd lost in the fire, couldn't be, not after everything she'd endured. But she was something perhaps even more precious. A young woman who had chosen love over fear, healing over hatred, hope over despair. "Grace," he said quietly, "your mother would be so proud of who you've become." She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that had taken months to feel natural but now seemed as right as sunrise. "I think she'd be proud of both of us, Daddy, for finding our way back to each other." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their wheat fields, Thomas Whitmore realized that sometimes the most important journeys weren't about going somewhere new, but about finding your way home to where you'd always belonged. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't about what we gain, but about what we refuse to give up on. Thomas Whitmore spent 20 years believing his daughter was gone forever, yet his heart never stopped hoping. In a world that often tells us to move on and let go, this story reminds us that love doesn't follow timelines or logic, it follows truth. For every grandparent separated from grandchildren, every parent wondering if they failed their adult children, every person who's lost someone they thought they'd never see again, Thomas and Grace's reunion speaks to something deeper than DNA tests or scientific proof. It speaks to the unbreakable bonds that define us as human beings. The wheat fields that Thomas thought would die with him are now golden with promise again, tended by hands that remember the soil even after 20 years away. This isn't just about a father finding his daughter. It's about rediscovering that home isn't a place, it's where love lives. And love, real love, never truly dies. It waits, it persists. It believes in second chances even when the world says it's impossible. Because sometimes impossible is just another word for miracle. What relationship in your life do you refuse to give up on? Have you ever experienced a moment when love proved stronger than logic?